Alright, dim the lights, get comfortable and lock the door. It's me, Strange, and you're back in the one place where Hollywood's dirtiest little secrets don't get buried under designer smiles, crisis publicists and fake spiritual growth posts on Instagram. This is Dirty Hollywood, welcome to the show! And tonight we're going straight into one of those stories that made people in this industry go dead quiet for a second. The kind of story where everyone suddenly wasn't there. Nobody saw anything, and every publicist in Beverly Hills probably started sweating through 6 layers of luxury fabric. Because the second word started spreading that Justin Bieber and Usher had some kind of ugly, heated confrontation at Beyoncé and Jay-Z's Oscars after party. I knew this was not just random celebrity drama, not even close. No, this had the smell of old resentment, old control, old debts, the kind of tension that doesn't explode out of nowhere. The kind that sits under the floorboards for years, rotting, swelling, waiting for just one wrong look, one wrong sentence, one wrong night in the wrong room. And that's exactly why I'm here, because everybody else is gonna give you the polished version, the safe version, the little entertainment news version, where they say something like, sources say the two stars had a tense interaction, but the cause remains unclear. Oh, the cause remains unclear? Really? That's cute, that's adorable. Two men with that much history don't nearly blow up at one of the most elite parties in Hollywood because somebody stepped on somebody's shoe. Come on, we all know that's bullshit. So tonight I am pulling this thing apart piece by piece. I am going all the way back to the beginning, back before the screaming fans, back before the money, back before the tabloid meltdowns and the polished interviews and the carefully rehearsed brotherhood language. Back to the moment when a talented kid from Canada got pulled into a machine so huge, so hungry and so filthy that it was always going to leave scars on everybody it touched. And trust me, by the time I'm done, that little heated exchange at the party is gonna look like the least shocking part of this whole story. Because what happened between Justin Bieber and Usher was never just about one party. It was about ownership, it was about image, it was about who gets credit, who gets blamed, who gets to rewrite history, and who gets furious when the person they helped create decides he doesn't want to play the role anymore. That's the real story. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So let's go there. Picture the scene. The Chateau Marmont after the Oscars. Not some cheap nightclub with sticky floors and bottle girls pretending they don't hate their lives. No. The Chateau. Old Hollywood decay dressed up as luxury. Dim lighting, expensive liquor, velvet shadows. Famous faces pretending they're relaxed while every person in the room is secretly performing for every other person in the room. You can practically smell the money in the walls. Perfume, smoke, aged wood, champagne, sweat, old secrets, that kind of room. Beyoncé and Jay-Z hosting, which means the room is packed with power, real power. Stars, executives, stylists, artists, athletes, industry parasites in custom tailoring. People who can make a scandal disappear by sunrise if it serves them. People who've spent decades learning how to smile while they're lying straight to your face. And in that room, with all those eyes, all that status, all that pressure, something goes wrong between Justin Bieber and Usher. The reporting that came out afterward made it sound restrained. Of course it did. They used phrases like heated exchange. Some version said Usher approached Justin with anger. Some chatter tried to make it sound like it was close to becoming physical. Other people pushed back and said it didn't get that far. No clean public explanation. No big dramatic statement. No official sit down. Just that little leak. Just enough to tell us that something ugly happened. Just enough to let the public smell the smoke without showing us the fire. And here's where I need you to stop thinking like a fan for a second and start thinking like an investigator. Because if you look at this like a normal celebrity story, you miss everything. This is not just two pop stars getting into it. This is a former child star and one of the men who helped sell him to the world. That's different, that changes everything. Justin Bieber and Usher were never equals in the original story. They were never just two artists who happened to cross paths. The entire mythology of Justin's rise was built around the idea that he was discovered, chosen, mentored, elevated, that he was a special kid who got plucked out of obscurity and brought into the kingdom by men who knew what greatness looked like. And one of the biggest names attached to that mythology was Usher. That's what makes this whole thing so nasty, because the public loves the fairy tale version. Small town kid, single mother, homemade videos online, big break, superstar mentor, overnight fame, everybody cries, everybody claps, cue the inspirational music. But the real version is never that clean. Justin Bieber was a kid, a very talented kid, yes, charismatic, cute, extremely marketable. He had the face, the voice, the vulnerability, the camera appeal, the whole package. But he was still a kid, and once adults in the music business saw what he could become, he stopped being just a kid with talent and started becoming something else. A product, a brand, a machine waiting to be built. That's the part they always try to soften with inspirational language. They say opportunity, they say guidance, they say mentorship. And sometimes those words are true. Sometimes there is genuine care in there. Sometimes there really is love. But in this industry, love and leverage are always sitting way too close together. That's the problem. Because when a grown man helps shape a boy into a global star, the emotional math gets dangerous real fast. At first, it looks beautiful, generous even. Look at me helping the next generation. Look at me opening the door. Look at me believing in talent. But once the kid becomes huge, once he becomes bigger than anybody expected, once the money multiplies, the pressure multiplies, the scandals multiply, and the trauma multiplies, then the relationship starts changing. The mentor may still say all the right words, the protege may still smile for the cameras, but under the surface, now there's debt, now there's expectation, now there's ego, now there's a fight over narrative. Because once you help create a star, part of you may always feel like you own a piece of that story. Not necessarily on paper, not necessarily in law, but psychologically, socially, in the mythology of fame, absolutely. And Justin's rise was one of the biggest, fastest, most aggressively monetized pop explosions of the modern era. Let's be honest about it. He didn't just get famous, he got consumed. The world didn't simply discover Justin Bieber, it swallowed him whole. The screaming crowds, the merchandise, the interviews, the tours, the cameras in his face every time he blinked wrong, the internet obsession, the weird adult fixation on a teenage boy, the endless headlines, the instant judgments, the public ridicule the second he started showing cracks. Everybody wanted a piece. Funds, media, labels, managers, brands, haters, even people who claimed to care about him were often still making money because he existed. That's not a normal adolescence, that's industrial scale extraction. And when people talk about Justin's early years, that's the first thing I need them to stop glossing over. Because his public biography gets told like a miracle story, but structurally it looks a lot more like a high-speed corporate acquisition with a teenage face attached to it. He was raised by Patty Mallet, a young mother in Canada. He was performing early, posting videos, building attention online. Scooter Braun found him. He got brought into Atlanta. Usher became part of the co-signing machinery. Deals got made. Doors opened, and just like that, the origin myth was born. But the myth is not the same thing as the truth. The truth is that a bunch of adults saw a kid and understood how big the business could get. And Usher mattered in that business. Not because he was secretly controlling every second of Justin's life, let's not get stupid. That's not what I'm saying. But he mattered because his name gave the whole thing legitimacy, prestige, protection, a bridge between a child with internet buzz and a serious pop industry launch. He wasn't just a bystander, he became part of the architecture. That matters now, a lot. Because when someone is built into your origin story that deeply, separating from them later is never simple. It's never just, hey man, we grew apart. No! It becomes symbolic, it becomes emotional, it becomes reputational, it becomes a fight over who shaped whom, who owes whom and who gets written out of the official legend. And Hollywood is obsessed with legends. That's the whole game. Nobody here just wants success. They want authorship. They want to be seen as the one who discovered it, built it, saved it, elevated it. They want their fingerprints on the masterpiece forever. That way, when history gets written, they're in the frame too. So now ask yourself this. What happens when the masterpiece starts tearing the frame apart? Because Justin did not follow the clean little script the industry prefers. He became one of the most famous young men on earth and then very publicly started unraveling in ways that made the people around him look either helpless, opportunistic, exploitative, or all three at once. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because the public was happy to consume his breakdowns as entertainment for years. Let's not lie, people mocked him when he spiraled. They laughed at the mugshots, the incidents, the behavior, the emotional instability, the arrogance, the chaos. But behind all of that was a much darker question nobody wanted to sit with for too long. What exactly happens to a boy when the adults around him build $1 billion ecosystem around his existence before he is emotionally equipped to survive it? That's not just Justin's question, by the way. That's one of Hollywood's oldest crimes. Child stars, teen stars, manufactured stars, boy band stars, Disney stars, Nickelodeon stars, viral stars. The faces change, but the pattern is always there. Adults package youth, sell intimacy, market vulnerability, collect the cash, and then act confused when the human being inside the product starts bleeding through the plastic wrap. And if you're wondering why I'm pushing so hard on that point, it's because this party confrontation starts making a lot more sense once you stop viewing Justin Bieber as just a celebrity and start viewing him as someone who has spent most of his life inside a machine built by older, more powerful people. That kind of life leaves residue. Even in the best case scenario, even if some people genuinely cared, even if some people meant well, even if no one set out to destroy anybody. Fame at that level still warps everything. Trust gets warped, identity gets warped, dependency gets warped, gratitude gets warped, memory gets warped, and eventually every relationship attached to the origin story gets tested. Usher wasn't just another name in the industry, he was one of the names attached to the beginning. Which means every shift in Justin's relationship to his own past also becomes indirectly a shift in Justin's relationship to Usher. That's why I don't buy the casual version of this story for a single second. There was already tension in the air long before this party, and one of the clearest public examples came when fans expected Justin to appear during Usher's massive halftime moment, and it didn't happen. On paper, everything stayed polite. Very polite. Too polite. The kind of polite that makes my skin itch. Usher said there was no love lost. Justin congratulated him. Everybody acted normal. But let's be real. In Hollywood, "there's no bad blood" is one of the most suspicious sentences ever invented. Because sometimes it's true, and sometimes it means we're absolutely not discussing this in public because everybody involved knows it's bigger than we can safely explain right now. A reunion between them would have been nostalgia gold. It would have fed the old mentor-protege mythology beautifully. It would have made headlines. It would have been easy. And when something that easy doesn't happen, I pay attention. Maybe Justin didn't want it. Maybe he didn't feel up to it. Maybe he didn't want to be pulled backward into an old narrative. Maybe it was completely innocent. Maybe it wasn't. That's the problem with Hollywood. Even the silence has layers. Then you add in the reports and public discussion around Justin pulling away from people tied to earlier phases of his life, cutting off relationships, reevaluating his circle, creating distance from people who no longer served him. That kind of language is not casual. That's not, "oh, he's taking a social media break." That's severance language. That's what people say when there has been a real internal earthquake. And when somebody with Justin's history starts doing that, I immediately want to know who feels threatened by it. Because self-protection in this industry gets rebranded as betrayal all the time. Read that again in your head. Self-protection gets rebranded as betrayal. A younger star tries to distance himself from the people who once managed him, guided him, shaped him, packaged him, or emotionally claimed him. And suddenly the room starts whispering that he is ungrateful, that he forgot who made him, that he is difficult, rude, delusional, unstable, disrespectful, cold. But what if he is not being cold? What if he is being careful? What if he is trying to survive a past that still has hooks in him? See, this is the ugly emotional blackmail hidden inside so many celebrity origin stories. Gratitude becomes a leash. The younger person is expected to stay emotionally legible forever, stay accessible, stay reverent, stay available, stay loyal to the people who help build them, no matter how complicated those relationships become. And the second they stop doing that, people take it personally. That's exactly why the reports framing Usher as approaching Justin with anger matter so much, because that suggests pursuit, it suggests confrontation, it suggests that whatever was boiling under the surface had reached a point where one man decided he was no longer willing to let it sit there untouched. And that's not random. Men do not storm into that kind of room with that kind of energy unless something has been building for a while. You don't risk your own image at a Beyoncé and Jay-Z Oscars after party over some tiny misunderstanding. Not if you're Usher. Not if you understand cameras, rumors, optics, and how this game is played. You do it because the emotion underneath has gotten stronger than the instinct to stay polished. And that's where my ears really perk up. Because when highly disciplined celebrities lose their cool in highly curated spaces, I stop listening to the official language and start looking for structural reasons. Not the trigger, the structure. The trigger could have been a look, a refusal, a cold shoulder, a dismissive comment, a conversation that had been avoided too long, something one of them said about the other behind closed doors, something about history, something about respect, something about access, something about who still gets to matter in whose life. But the structure, that's the deeper truth. The structure is that Justin Bieber's life story has always been entangled with men who were older, more powerful, more industry savvy, and in different ways invested in what he represented. The structure is that Usher's legacy partly intersects with being seen as one of the people who helped usher Justin into superstardom. The structure is that Justin, as an adult man now, may not want to live forever inside the emotional terms of a story written when he was barely a teenager. That's combustible. And then you add fame trauma on top of it. Because Justin has publicly talked over the years about mental health struggles, self-worth issues, depression, feeling overwhelmed, feeling like a fraud. That matters a lot. A person carrying that kind of internal instability is not walking through old Hollywood relationships with some neat, tidy emotional map. Old pain gets activated. Old loyalty gets questioned. Old wounds flare up fast. So when he starts shrinking his circle, distancing himself, reevaluating people, and then there's a reported confrontation with a major figure from his origin story, I do not think that's a coincidence. I think that's a pattern surfacing. And here's where it gets even uglier. If there really are people around this whole story trying to frame Justin as the problem, as the rude one, as the guy who's trying to erase everybody from his past, then that itself tells me there is a narrative war happening behind the scenes. Because that phrase is loaded. Erase everybody from his past. That's not neutral language, that's accusation language. That's the kind of phrase people leak when they want the public to interpret distance as cruelty. It turns Justin into the villain of his own origin story, makes him sound spoiled, ungrateful, emotionally reckless, the brat who got everything and decided the people who built him were disposable. Very convenient. But maybe the truth is darker. Maybe he is not trying to erase the past. Maybe he's trying to get free of it. Those are not the same thing. And Hollywood knows the difference. It just pretends not to, when pretending is more profitable. That's why this story fascinates me. What fascinates me is that this argument appears to sit right on top of one of the most sensitive fault lines in modern pop culture, the emotional depth built into child stardom. Because what do you owe the people who turned you into a phenomenon? Everything, something, nothing. Public gratitude forever, private access forever, loyalty even if the relationship changes, silence even if the past hurts. That's the question lurking under this whole mess. And I'm telling you now, once that question enters the room, it poisons everything. A skipped collaboration doesn't stay a skipped collaboration. An unfollow doesn't stay an unfollow. A cold hello doesn't stay a cold hello. A little confrontation at the party doesn't stay a little confrontation. Everything becomes loaded, everything becomes symbolic, everything starts standing in for 10 years of unresolved emotion. And you know what makes this even more sinister? The fact that the public still doesn't know what the exact trigger was. That almost makes it worse. Because when a story leaks without a clear explanation, people fill the vacuum with whatever helps their side most. Publicists start nudging. Friends of friends suddenly become sources. Bloggers dress speculation up like certainty. Old clips get reposted. Ancient rumors get dragged out of the grave and stapled onto new events. Everybody starts building their preferred version of reality. That's when a real investigator has to slow down. I don't need fake certainty, I need signal. And the signal here is very clear. The signal is that a relationship tied to Justin's origin story appears to be under serious strain. The signal is that Justin has been publicly connected to a period of cutting off relationships and re-evaluating his life. The signal is that Usher reportedly came in with anger, not calm. The signal is that the confrontation happened in one of the most image-controlled environments imaginable. The signal is that the old mythology no longer seems stable. That's enough for me to know this matters. Because this is not just gossip, this is fallout. And if you ask me what I think really happened in the broadest sense, here's my answer. I think the confrontation at the party was the visible crack in a much older structure. I think Justin has been pulling away from parts of the world that made him. I think some of the people connected to that world do not like what that pullback implies. I think years of unspoken resentment, confusion, disappointment, and narrative control may have finally boiled over in public just enough for the rest of us to smell it. And I think the reason the official story is still so vague is because the real one is probably way too uncomfortable for everyone involved. That's the part people never say. Sometimes a scandal stays vague not because nothing happened, but because too much happened. And nobody wants to be the first person to explain the full chain reaction. So no, I am not buying the celebs being messy version. I think this goes much deeper. I think this is about what happens when a boy becomes a machine, then grows into a man who may no longer want to be emotionally available to the people who profited, guided, shaped, or defined that machine. And if that's true, then what happened at that party was never the beginning of the story, it was the leak. It was the moment the pressure hissed through the wall loud enough for everybody else to hear it. And this is where I stop staring at the party itself and start pulling on the people around it. Because if you really want to understand what blew up between Justin Bieber and Usher Raymond, you have to look at the entire machine that stood between them from the beginning. Not the fairy tale, the machine. And sitting right in the middle of that machine, grinning like the guy who always knew where the money was Scooter Braun. Scott Samuel Braun did not just discover Justin. That word is way too cute for what this really was. He spotted an opening. He saw a kid online with an instantly marketable face, a voice that could be polished into radio gold, and a backstory that could be sold like catnip to the public. Young mother, small town, homemade videos, innocence, hunger, destiny. It was perfect. Not because it was fake, but because it was useful. That's how the best industry myths work. You don't invent them from scratch. You find the true story, strip it down, shine it up, and sell the version that makes the most money. So Scooter gets Justin from Stratford into Atlanta. Patty Mallet comes along because obviously her son is still a kid. And this is the part where people always jump straight to the glossy montage version. The meetings, the introductions, the possibility, the excitement, the can you believe this is happening energy. But let's slow that down for a second and sit in the reality of it. A teenage boy and his mother enter a city built on the music business. They are stepping into rooms where everybody knows the language of leverage except them. Everybody in those rooms understands contracts, percentages, branding, image, control, future touring revenue, merch splits, licensing, distribution, publishing, sponsorships, long-term exploitation of likeness, all of it. Justin has talent, Patty has dreams and a son to protect. The men around them have experience and ambition. Guess who holds the power in that situation? That doesn't mean every person in the room is evil. Don't flatten it into a cartoon. But it does mean the structure is unequal from the start. And once you understand that, everything that comes later starts looking less like random celebrity chaos and more like the long tail of an imbalance that was baked into the origin story from day one. Usher mattered there because he gave the project cultural legitimacy. Scooter Braun had the hunger. Usher had the glow. He was already a star, already respected, already connected. If Justin just got picked up by some ambitious manager, that's one story. But if Usher Raymond gets involved, now suddenly the public doesn't see a business extraction process. They see blessing. They see mentorship. They see an established artist putting his arm around a kid and saying, "This one matters." That image is worth a fortune. And once that image is out there, it never really goes away. People talk about Justin Bieber's launch like it was some natural miracle, but it was engineered with incredible precision. The hair, the smile, the songs, the vulnerability, the innocent flirty energy that made girls scream and made adults immediately realize they were looking at a global merchandising opportunity. Nothing about that scale happens accidentally. Somebody was making decisions every step of the way. Somebody was thinking about audience capture, emotional branding, fan attachment, press strategy, platform growth. This was not just talent meeting fate, it was talent entering systems, and the people closest to the launch got rewarded for that system working. That's where the emotional road begins, by the way, because when a kid turns into a hit that big, every adult around him starts telling himself a different story about what he contributed. The manager thinks, "I found him." The mentor thinks, "I gave him credibility." The label thinks, "We built the platform." The family thinks, "We sacrificed everything." The audience thinks, "We made him." And the kid himself is standing in the center of it, probably not fully understanding which parts of his life belong to him anymore and which parts got swallowed by everybody else's version of events. That is not just pressure, that is identity theft with applause. And if you want one of the ugliest truths in the music business, here it is. People love child stars and teenage stars because youth creates emotional intensity on both ends. The audience projects innocence and possibility onto the kid. The industry projects scale and revenue onto the kid. Both sides are feeding. One side calls it love, the other side calls it opportunity. The result is the same. The kid becomes public property. Justin became public property so fast, it probably felt like a car crash happening in slow motion. One day he's a talented kid with a camera, then suddenly he's everywhere. Radio, award shows, interviews, paparazzi, fan mobs, television spots, endless online commentary. Every gesture turning into content, every haircut becoming discourse, every expression becoming a story. It sounds glamorous until you really think about what it does to a human nervous system. Imagine hitting puberty while the planet is monetizing your face. Imagine being judged like an adult, desired like a fantasy, controlled like an investment, and talked to like a child all at the same time. That was Justin's actual environment. And the adults around him, even the ones who cared, were still operating inside a system that benefited from keeping the machine running. That's why I never fully trust the soft language that gets used around these stories. Guidance, support, family, brotherhood, protection. Those words can be real, they can also be camouflage. Because in entertainment, somebody can care about you and still profit from your instability. Somebody can love you and still need the product version of you to stay alive. That contradiction destroys people. Now let's talk about Patty Mallet, because she gets reduced way too often to the supporting character in her own son's mythology. Patty's life story, the version the public got, was wrapped in hardship, faith, struggle, survival. And that story mattered because it made Justin's rise even more emotionally irresistible. Single mom, difficult road, son with a gift. It played beautifully in interviews. It made the public root for them. It also made the whole enterprise feel morally cleaner than it probably was. Because who's going to question an industry pipeline if the story is framed like a blessing arriving to save a struggling family? That's the elegance of it. The machine doesn't always need to lie. Sometimes it just needs a sympathetic protagonist. But here is the thing. A mother can love her son completely and still be in over her head once the business gets involved. That's not an insult, that's reality. The scale of what happened around Justin outgrew normal parental power almost immediately. Once labels, managers, teams, security, publicists, brand partners, tour operators and lawyers surround the teenager, the parent is not dealing with a family problem anymore. She's dealing with a corporation with a pulse. And inside that corporation, emotional authority gets really messy. Who gets to discipline him? Who gets to advise him? Who gets to intervene? Who gets to say no? Who gets to say what's normal? The moment multiple adults start sharing those functions around a young star, the kid's emotional map gets scrambled. Father figures, business figures, friend figures, employee figures, authority figures all start blurring together. That matters a lot when we talk about Usher, because public mentorship creates a very strange emotional contract. It doesn't have the clean boundaries of a real parent-child relationship. It doesn't have the clean boundaries of a pure business arrangement either. It lives in this murky space where affection, branding, loyalty, gratitude, image and hierarchy all overlap. That kind of bond can look beautiful from the outside and still become incredibly toxic over time. Especially once the younger person stops playing the grateful role the world expects. And Justin absolutely stopped playing the role people expected from him. Not immediately. At first he gave them what they wanted. The pop prince, the sweet kid, the heartthrob, the little chaos in the eyes that made the fans even more obsessed. But then came the years where the cracks started showing in ways the public could no longer romanticize so easily. And this is where a lot of people get lazy. They reduce Justin's rough years into a meme reel. The arrests, the scandals, the headlines, the attitude, the public apologies, the religious resets, the comeback arcs. But when I look at that period, I do not see random bad behavior floating in empty space. I see somebody raised inside a pressure chamber with almost no chance of having a normal emotional development path. Again, that does not erase responsibility. He made choices, some ugly ones, some reckless ones, some cruel ones probably. But if you only talk about the choices and never the environment, you are not investigating anything. You're just moralizing after the damage is done. And let's name another person whose presence hangs over this whole story, whether people like it or not. Hailey Bieber. Because whenever Justin tries to pull away from old systems, old chaos, old expectations, Hailey becomes part of that process, whether she asks for the role or not. That's how celebrity marriages work. The spouse becomes both witness and screen. People project control onto her, blame onto her, salvation onto her, influence onto her. If Justin is distant from former associates, people will wonder whether Hailey encouraged it. If he reconciles, they'll wonder whether she approved. It's ridiculous, but it's real. Hailey Road Bieber has spent years being dragged into narratives she did not create. Fans read her marriage like a hostile takeover. Critics read it like a PR strategy. Gossip addicts read it like a war with ghosts from Justin's past. And through all of that, she's standing next to a man whose life has been publicly unstable, spiritually restless, and emotionally difficult to decode. So if there really has been a major reordering of Justin's relationships, of course people around him would notice Hailey's position in it. Not because she's secretly scripting every move, but because marriage changes the architecture of access. Once there is a wife, the old gatekeepers are no longer the only ones in the room. That alone can create resentment. You see this over and over in entertainment. The old team hates the new intimacy. The new intimacy hates the old influence. The celebrity in the middle gets torn between history and survival. Everybody smiles in public, everybody bleeds in private. Now let's get back to Scooter Braun, because if you're trying to figure out why a conflict with Usher might have so much voltage behind it, you cannot ignore the fact that Scooter's own relationship with Justin has been under years of intense scrutiny. Public reports and industry chatter have circled around distance, business fractures, shifting alliances, money questions, strategic resets. I'm not going to turn unverified rumor into holy scripture, but let's not pretend the Braun-Bieber relationship remained some untouched sacred bond. It clearly got complicated. And once that happens, every other relationship from the early orbit comes under suspicion too, because these worlds overlap. The manager, the mentor, the label, the family story, the faith story, the comeback story, the marriage story, the brand story, all of it forms one giant knot. You start pulling on one strand and 5 other names move. That's why I think a lot of the public is misunderstanding the emotional scale of this alleged confrontation with Usher. They are treating it like an isolated moment between two celebrities. I think it's much more likely that it was the visible expression of years of accumulated tension between Justin and the original ecosystem around Justin. Not necessarily one giant conspiracy, don't cheapen it. Just a long build-up of emotional depth, competing narratives, and unresolved questions about who still has a claim on him. And here is where I want to get really blunt. When a former child star begins creating distance from the people associated with his rise, there are always 3 possibilities at war with each other. 1. He's becoming arrogant and impulsively cutting off anyone who reminds him where he came from. 2. He is trying to define adulthood on his own terms and rejecting people who still relate to him through the lens of his teenage fame. 3. He has finally started recognizing dynamics that never felt right, never healed right, or never belonged in his life as long as they did. The sick part: all 3 can be true at once. That's why these stories are so nasty. There is almost never one clean villain and one clean victim once years have passed. There are injuries on every side. There are manipulations that may not even feel like manipulations to the people doing them. There are old habits that calcified into entitlements. There are emotional depths nobody agreed on, but everybody acts like a binding. And then the whole thing gets detonated by fame, which distorts every interaction until even a simple boundary feels like a declaration of war. This is why I am suspicious of any report that tries to make Justin sound simply rude or disrespectful, without asking what kind of relationship pattern produced that reading. A grown man deciding he does not want old players in his emotional life anymore can look like cruelty from the outside. It can also be the first healthy thing he has done in years. Without the private context, those 2 versions are impossible to separate cleanly. And that private context is exactly what Hollywood protects. Because once you expose the real emotional mechanics of a star-making machine, the glamour starts to smell like chemicals. Now let's zoom in on Usher again, but not as the icon on stage, as the man, as the institution. As the person who has spent decades mastering public image, performance discipline, and the art of staying smooth in rooms full of sharks, a man like that does not usually give the blogs a messy little confrontation for free. That is what keeps bothering me. If the reporting is accurate that Usher was the one who came in hot, then that means something pierced the polish. And when polish cracks, I want to know whether it was anger, hurt, humiliation, fear, or some ugly mixture of all 4. Because anger is often just the mask that gets to show up in public when the real feeling is more embarrassing. What if it wasn't just anger? What if it was injury? What if Justin's distancing has been read inside that old circle not as he needs space, but as he is rejecting the story we built together? For someone whose legacy includes helping shape Justin's launch, that could stink in a very specific way. It could feel like historical erasure. It could feel like disrespect. It could feel like the younger star is rewriting the legend and cutting out the names that were there at the beginning. And if that's how Usher sees it, then the party confrontation stops looking like random aggression and starts looking like a man reacting to what he experiences as narrative death. That is a terrifying thing in Hollywood. These people care about legacy like normal people care about oxygen. You can take money from a rich celebrity and he'll survive. You can take time and he'll survive. You can take privacy and he'll adapt. But make him feel like history is being rewritten without him. That's when you get the real rage. Because legacy is the only thing they think lasts. Now flip it and look at the same thing from Justin's side. What if every attempt to define himself outside the old mythology keeps getting interpreted as disrespect? What if every choice to limit access, refuse symbolic reunions, reevaluate relationships, or avoid old emotional scripts gets thrown back at him as some kind of moral failure? That would be maddening too, especially for someone who has spent his whole life being told who he is by everybody else. Justin has had more identities imposed on him than most people have outfits in their closet. Teen idol, problem child, bad boy, fallen star, redeemed believer, husband, comeback artist, unstable genius, washed up cautionary tale, saved man, broken man. Every few years the culture builds a new costume and tries to zip him into it.
So maybe part of what we're seeing now is him rejecting yet another costume, the eternally grateful protege.
And if that's true, then the conflict with Usher becomes emotionally inevitable. Because mentorship stories only stay clean if both people keep agreeing to the script. The older figure gets reverence, the younger figure gets context. Everybody smiles. Nobody asks who benefited more or who paid for it psychologically. The second one person stops performing that script, all the buried power dynamics come rushing out. That's why I keep saying this story is not really about one night. The night was just where the history leaked. And there is one more person I need to bring into the frame here, not because I think she caused anything, but because she helps explain why the old machinery may be under more strain now than ever before. Patty again. The older Justin gets, the less the original mother and son miracle narrative can do the work it used to do. In the beginning, Patty's presence anchored him to innocence. It softened the entire operation. But as Justin became an adult, married, and more insulated, the old emotional framing started to lose its public power. Which means the people tied to the early legend had fewer automatic ways to stay symbolically central unless Justin actively kept them there. That is crucial because symbolic centrality is half the battle in celebrity history. Once you are no longer needed in the present, you fight to remain essential in the past. That's how names survive. That's how stories are remembered. That's how power keeps echoing after the contracts change. So if Justin has truly been stripping his life down, narrowing access, and deciding who still gets emotional or narrative closeness, then every legacy figure from the early era has reason to feel uneasy. Not because they're all villains, but because nobody likes being moved from living center to historical footnote. And sometimes footnotes lash out. Now let's address the thing some people keep dancing around in whispers, not facts. Whispers. Word on the street from people who obsess over this world is that the tension around Justin's old circle has been building through a combination of silence, changed priorities, and frozen out communication. No clean public evidence gives me the right to tell you exactly who said what to whom in private. I am not going to fake that. But the shape of the rumor cloud is obvious. Justin appears to be pulling inward. Old industry ties appear less stable, and the people who once had smooth, unquestioned positions in his orbit may not have those positions anymore. That kind of transition is brutal in any family, any business, any marriage, any friend group. In Hollywood, it becomes war by subtext. People don't always scream what they feel. They leak it, they hint it, they let a source say it, they weaponize body language at parties, they let one ugly moment go public and trust that everybody in town will fill in the blanks. That's why the alleged confrontation matters even without a transcript. It tells us the temperature, it tells us the old diplomacy may be failing, it tells us the room is no longer fully controlled. And once a room like that slips out of control, even for a second, you learn more than you're supposed to. What did we learn? We learned that the connection between Justin Bieber and Usher Raymond is no longer the smooth, polished mythology people got sold. We learned that old history is not staying buried as neatly as publicists would prefer. We learned that the Bieber story is still radiating tension through the people who helped create it. And we learned that whatever Justin is doing with his life right now, it is strong enough to upset the architecture of the past. That last point is huge, because men like Usher do not just react to random disrespect. They react when something bigger is moving under the floor, something identity level, something legacy level, something that changes how the story gets told from now on. And if I'm being totally honest with you, that may be the real nightmare underneath all of this. Not that Justin and Usher argued, not that some party went sour, not that gossip sites got a juicy week. The real nightmare is that one of the most profitable mentor-protege myths in modern pop may be collapsing under the weight of adulthood, memory, and the fact that the person at its center is no longer willing to let everybody else define what his past means. That is the kind of thing Hollywood cannot stand. Because Hollywood does not mind trauma. It minds independence. It does not mind collapse. It minds people rewriting the collapse in their own words. And if Justin is finally doing that, even quietly, even clumsily, even imperfectly, then what happened at that party may have been the first time the old order realized it was no longer dealing with the same boy it once helped package. It was dealing with a man who might be trying to shut the door. And some people cannot handle a door closing unless they believe they are the ones who closed it. That's what I think was in there. Not one petty insult, not one random misunderstanding. History, ownership, access, narrative, depth, pride. The kind of cocktail that looks elegant in a crystal glass until you realize it's actually gasoline. And this is the point where I stop asking what the room looked like and start asking what Justin Bieber looked like after the room was gone. Because that is the part people keep skipping. They want the confrontation, they want the glamorous mess, they want the image of Justin Bieber and Usher Raymond standing a little too close at a party hosted by Beyoncé, Knowles Carter and Sean Carter, with half of Hollywood pretending not to notice. That's the clickable version, that's the cheap version. But the real story lives in what fame did to Justin long before that night ever happened. Not the brand, not the headlines, not the playlists, the human damage. And if I'm going to tell this story honestly, I have to go right into the years where Justin stopped being a fantasy and started becoming a warning sign. Because let's be honest, people loved Justin Bieber the most when they could consume him without having to think about what they were consuming. They loved him as a boy wonder, they loved him as a poster, they loved him as a trend, they loved him as a punchline, they loved him as a redemption arc. But very few people really wanted to sit with the ugly reality of what it means to become famous that young, that fast, that completely. A normal teenager gets to screw up in private. He gets to be arrogant, insecure, confused, horny, reckless, needy, angry, immature, self-obsessed, contradictory, and occasionally unbearable without it becoming a global referendum on his soul. Justin never had that luxury. His mistakes didn't just happen, they were industrialized. Every dumb choice became a headline, every ugly face became content, every bad night became a moral drama. Millions of strangers who had never met him decided they understood him from one photograph, one leaked clip, one bad quote, one paparazzi confrontation, one smirk, one stumble, one grainy video, one mugshot, one rumor from somebody's cousin's assistant's driver. That kind of scrutiny doesn't just make a person defensive, it changes the chemistry of how they experience themselves. And once that happens, every relationship around them starts getting poisoned in slow motion. Because now the star doesn't know who actually sees him and who sees the machine. He doesn't know who loves him and who loves access. He doesn't know whether advice is really care or just reputation management with a friendly tone. He doesn't know whether someone is protecting him or containing him. He doesn't know whether someone misses him or misses the version of him that was easier to monetize. That kind of uncertainty can turn a famous person into something very hard to be close to. Paranoid, needy, detached, self-destructive, defiant, impossible to reach one day and desperate for connection the next. And if you follow Justin Bieber's public life for more than 5 minutes, you know those contradictions have been all over him for years. 1 minute he looks like a man begging for peace, the next he looks like he wants to burn the entire circus down. 1 minute he's talking about healing, the next he seems to vanish into silence, anger, exhaustion, or some weird zone where nobody can tell whether he is retreating, recovering, or unraveling. That does not happen in a vacuum. It happens when a person spends too many years being performed at. That's a phrase I want you to keep with you, performed at. People didn't just watch Justin, they projected onto him. They needed him to symbolize something for them. Innocence, desire, rebellion, hope, corruption, salvation, collapse, comeback. They were constantly telling him what he meant, often while he was still trying to figure out who the hell he actually was. And that's one of the most psychologically violent things fame can do. It doesn't just invade your life, it colonizes your identity. Then add religion into the mix. Now we're getting into the really slippery stuff. Because Justin's public relationship with faith has been one of the most heavily discussed and most poorly understood parts of his adult life. And I'm not talking about shallow gossip like, oh, he got religious again. I'm talking about the deeper emotional function that faith can serve for someone whose life has been chewed up by fame, shame, temptation, public humiliation, and the constant pressure to turn pain into an inspirational brand asset. Faith can be grounding. It can save people. It can give structure to chaos. It can offer mercy to someone who hates himself. It can also become another system of authority, another source of dependency, another network of people speaking into your life with absolute confidence, while you are too emotionally exhausted to tell who is helping and who is just replacing one script with another. And Justin's orbit has had plenty of that kind of energy around it. Pastors, spiritual advisors, men with charisma, men with language, men who know how to present discipline as love and influence as guidance. That world overlaps a lot more comfortably with celebrity than people realize. Hollywood loves spiritual language when it helps repackage damage without requiring structural honesty. It's the perfect cleanup tool. The star spirals, disappears, hurts people, hurts himself, comes back talking about healing, grace, purpose, surrender, rebirth. The press eats it up. Fans call it growth. Teams call it stabilization. The public gets a redemption story. Everybody moves on. But the internal reality may be much messier. Because healing that happens under constant public observation is never clean. And healing that happens while a person is still surrounded by fame structures, business interests, old loyalties, and emotional opportunists is even less clean. Sometimes what looks like spiritual peace from the outside is actually just a new language layered over old fractures. Justin has often seemed like a man trying to escape himself and explain himself at the same time. That's a horrible place to live, and it has consequences. It changes how you hear old voices. It changes how you interpret old loyalties. It changes how much access people get to the wounded parts of you. It changes what you can tolerate from the people who knew you before you started trying to rebuild. That matters because the people from Justin's earlier life did not meet the same man who exists now. They met the boy, the exploding star, the kid inside the machine. And once someone knows you in one of those earlier versions, they often keep talking to that version long after you've outgrown it. Sometimes they do it lovingly, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes manipulatively, but they do it. And for a person trying to reclaim his adulthood, that can feel like suffocation. This is why I think so much of the public keeps misreading Justin's distance from old relationships. They're interpreting it through etiquette. I'm interpreting it through survival psychology. Because if your nervous system has been cooked by fame for years, you don't always cut people off because of one dramatic betrayal. Sometimes you cut them off because being around them keeps dragging you back into a version of yourself you are trying desperately not to become again. Maybe they remind you of chaos. Maybe they remind you of pressure. Maybe they remind you of who you were when everybody had a hand on you. Maybe they trigger a level of emotional regression you can't afford anymore. Maybe every interaction with them feels like getting zipped back into old skin. And if Justin's life has been anything, it's a series of attempted sheds. New era, new sound, new image, new woman, new face language, new boundaries, new circle, new silence, new rules. People call that inconsistency. Sometimes it's actually somebody crawling toward the self he's never been allowed to stabilize. Let's take the body for a second, because the body tells the truth long before the publicist does. Years of relentless attention do not just produce bad headlines. They produce physiological consequences. Sleep gets destroyed, cortisol stays high, trust systems go haywire, mood swings intensify, decision-making gets impulsive, dissociation becomes seductive. Isolation starts feeling safer than contact. Even joy gets complicated because any good moment can immediately turn into content for other people. You cannot live like that for years and come out emotionally symmetrical. You just can't. So when Justin started looking worn down in public at various points, withdrawn at others, hyper-scrutinized all the time, people kept reacting at the level of image. Is he okay? Is he spiraling? Is he using? Is he sick? Is he happy? Is Haley okay? Is the marriage okay? Is the career okay? But image-level questions miss the deeper point. The point is that the human system underneath the celebrity packaging has been under abnormal strain for so long that almost any new conflict should be viewed as part of a bigger injury pattern, not as isolated gossip. Now bring that back to Usher. If Justin has spent the past several years trying to get more control over his life, his mind, his body, and his emotional environment, then any relationship that still carries the energy of the old machine becomes inherently volatile. Not because Usher has to be some cartoon villain, he doesn't. He could genuinely care. He could genuinely feel confused, shut out, hurt, even protective in his own way. That may actually make it worse. Because relationships built from mixed motives are the hardest to untangle. If there had only ever been exploitation, the cutoff would be easier. If there had only ever been love, the repair would be easier. But when there's history, affection, image, ego, gratitude, utility, mentorship, and money all tangled together, nobody knows what exactly they are mourning when the bond starts breaking. That's the kind of relationship that can survive for years on politeness while rotting underneath. Then, one night, the politeness runs out, and suddenly everyone acts shocked. I'm not shocked. I'm shocked it took this long to leak. Now I want to talk about masculinity in this whole mess, because that is another layer people keep avoiding. Male celebrity culture is brutal when it comes to vulnerability. Men in this world are allowed to show success, dominance, control, confidence, style, spiritual certainty, sexual power, strategic cool, maybe even a little polished remorse if the PR team has done its homework. But uncertainty, hurt, dependency, fear of being replaced, fear of being forgotten, fear of losing emotional relevance to someone you helped shape, that stuff usually comes out sideways. It comes out as anger, it comes out as pride, it comes out as a confrontation at a party, it comes out as respect talk. It comes out as source-driven smear language. It comes out as coldness and ego games. I think a lot of what happened between Justin and Usher, whatever the exact trigger was, probably lives inside that sideways zone. Because what does a legacy male star do when a younger man he once helped launch is no longer signaling the same loyalty, availability, or symbolic closeness? He probably doesn't sit down and say, I feel wounded by the distance between us, and I'm struggling with what it means for how I understand our history. No. He gets angry, he gets sharp, he gets confrontational, he decides he's owed clarity, he decides this disrespect has gone on long enough. That's a much more socially acceptable male script in celebrity land. And what does a man like Justin do if he is already overwhelmed, already distrustful, already trying to protect fragile internal ground, and someone from the old order comes at him with heated energy in a room full of power players? He probably doesn't say, thank you for expressing your emotional conflict in a direct and healthy way. He probably braces, shuts down, snaps back, gets cold, gets defensive. or say something that cuts right through the old mythology and makes the other man feel like his place in the story is collapsing in real time. That's how these scenes ignite. Not because they're random, because they're overdetermined. Too much history, too little honesty, too much symbolism, too many witnesses, too much male pride. Now let's talk about witnesses, because oh yes, that matters. A confrontation in private is one thing. A confrontation in a room like that is another thing entirely. At a Beyoncé and Jay-Z Oscars after party, no one is just a bystander. Every witness is a node in a network. Everybody there has social value, gossip value, power value, or all three. That means the second tension flares, the emotional stakes get multiplied by embarrassment. A man who might keep his voice low in private may come in harder in a status room, because pride is already activated. A man who might explain himself calmly, one-on-one, may become colder, sharper, more performative when there's a crowd nearby. Every gesture gets infected by the awareness that other powerful people are seeing this happen. Nobody wants to look weak. Nobody wants to look controlled. Nobody wants to look nostalgic and discarded. Nobody wants to look childish. Nobody wants to look like the one who still cares more. That last one is lethal. So if Usher approached Justin with visible anger, then part of what may have been playing out was not just emotional frustration, but status panic. And if Justin responded in a way that read as detached, dismissive, or refusing to engage on the old terms, that could have hit even harder. Because dismissal wounds pride more deeply than open conflict does. Open conflict says, you still matter enough for me to fight you. Dismissal says, you no longer have the power to move me. In a legacy-driven, image-conscious male celebrity world, that can feel unbearable. Do I know that's exactly what happened? No, I'm not going to lie to you. But does that pattern fit the psychology of what we do know? Absolutely. And the more I think about it, the more I believe the confrontation may have been about something much more existential than a specific recent dispute. It may have been about relevance inside each other's stories. That's the phrase. Relevance. Usher may have expected a certain enduring place in Justin's emotional and public mythology. Justin may now be refusing to grant that place in the same way. Once that shift becomes obvious, every interaction changes temperature. Suddenly, the old gratitude doesn't land. The old meta tone sounds off. The old assumptions feel invasive. The old shared history doesn't comfort anybody. It accuses. And from Justin's side, if he feels people keep claiming authority over chapters of his life that cost him deeply, then even well-meant contact from old figures might register as intrusion rather than love. That's a devastating transformation, because it means the exact people who once felt safest, or at least most foundational, become triggers. And when foundational people become triggers, adulthood gets lonely fast. I think that loneliness is all over Justin Bieber's public story. Not just romantic loneliness, not just celebrity loneliness, historical loneliness. The loneliness of being the only person who knows what it felt like to live inside your own myth, while everyone else keeps arguing over what the myth meant. That kind of loneliness makes relationships brittle. It makes trust temporary. It makes old allies feel suspicious. It makes every interaction with someone from the early era come loaded with questions no polite conversation can actually carry. Do you miss me, or the version of me you benefited from? Do you care about me, or your place in my story? Are you here because you love me, or because history matters to you? If I change, do I still belong to myself, or do you experience that as betrayal? Those are not easy questions to bring into any relationship. They are almost impossible to bring into a celebrity relationship without causing damage. Which is why most people never ask them directly. They just act them out. And that is what I think we saw at the party. An acted out question. A whole decade plus of unresolved emotional math condensed into one toxic encounter. Now, I want to get even more specific about Justin's adult image, because this matters too. One of the cruelest things about his later years is that the public has often expected him to be both healed and permanently available as content. They want him well enough to perform, post, show up, smile, release music, maybe flirt with vulnerability in a digestible way and reassure everybody that the story still has a future. But if he actually withdraws, actually draws boundaries, actually reduces access, or actually becomes difficult to read, they punish him for that too. That's a no-win design. He's supposed to recover in public, but not in a way that inconveniences the audience. He's supposed to grow, but not in a way that disrupts old emotional investments. He's supposed to evolve, but not in a way that excludes the people who still define themselves through connection to him. That pressure doesn't just come from fans, it comes from the entire ecosystem. And if Usher, Scooter, old collaborators, old advisors, old team figures, or even old friends still see Justin partly through the lens of what he once represented, then they may be genuinely unprepared for the reality that adulthood sometimes looks like refusal. Not reconciliation, not tribute, not gratitude theater, refusal. Refusal to play the old role. Refusal to keep old access open. Refusal to revisit a mythology that no longer feels safe or true. People confuse refusal with cruelty all the time. Sometimes it is cruelty. Sometimes it's the only thing standing between a person and total collapse. That is why I am so careful about the language people use when they describe Justin cutting off old ties. That phrase can sound callous. It can also describe the desperate work of someone trying to regain authorship over his own life after years of being authored by everybody else. And let me tell you something else people in Hollywood hate. They hate losing interpretive control. It's not enough for them to have had access. They want the right to explain what happened. They want to narrate the relationship. They want the public to accept their version of the bond. And if Justin is becoming less available to that process, less willing to play along, less interested in publicly honoring the old power arrangement, then of course tension rises. Because now the old figures cannot fully control what they meant. They can only claim what they meant. And that's a much weaker position. I think that's part of why a confrontation in a public setting makes grim sense. Public settings are where narrative authority gets tested in real time. Who approaches whom? Who flinches? Who looks angry? Who looks detached? Who gets described as the aggressor? Who gets described as cold? Even the leak itself starts building a story before either man says a word. And once the leak is out, everybody starts fighting over the emotional frame. Was Usher confronting someone who had become rude and ungrateful? Was Justin defending boundaries against an old power dynamic? Was it grief? Was it ego? Was it accumulated resentment? Was it one more symptom of a man trying to cut the cords attached to his own mythology? My answer is probably the most uncomfortable one. It was some combination of all of it. Because reality is nastier than fandom and cleaner than conspiracy. It's usually a tangle, not a slogan. And if you really want the filthiest truth in this whole chapter, here it is. Justin Bieber may never have gotten the chance to know which relationships in his early rise were purely his. Think about that. Not good or bad. Not healthy or toxic. Just his. Untouched by commerce. Untouched by image. Untouched by strategic co-signing. Untouched by what his existence meant for other people's careers, reputations, companies, churches, tours, or legacy. That uncertainty alone could make any adult man want to burn down his contact list and start over with only 3 people and the locked gate. So when I hear people say, why would Justin distance himself from people who helped him? I hear a question from someone who has never had to wonder whether help and possession were braided together from the start. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't, maybe some were one and some were the other. Maybe the difference only became clear to him years later. Maybe it still isn't clear. Maybe that uncertainty is exactly what makes old interactions so combustible. And if that's the case, then the confrontation with Usher is even sadder than it is scandalous. Because then it's not just a fight, it's a failed translation. One man saying in effect, "How can you treat me like this after all this history?" The other man saying, maybe not in words but in energy, that history is exactly why this is so difficult. That's tragic, that's ugly, and that is pure Hollywood, because this town has a genius for turning human confusion into high-gloss mythology until the mythology finally cracks and everyone acts stunned to discover there were people inside it the whole time. And I haven't even gotten to the nastiest layer yet. Because once you start asking what Justin's fame did to Justin, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who benefited most while he was being psychologically ground down? And who now has the most to lose if he keeps pulling away from the people, institutions and old emotional structures that were wrapped around him from the very beginning? That's where the money starts talking. And when money starts talking in Hollywood, the truth usually gets real ugly, real fast. And that's where I stop treating this like a wounded ego story and start following the money. Because the second you do that, the whole thing gets colder. A lot colder. Because fame trauma is one layer, emotional depth is another, legacy panic is another, but money is the layer that makes people smile while they're lying. And if you want to understand why a relationship between Justin Bieber and Usher Raymond could curdle into something tense enough to spill at a party hosted by Beyoncé and Carter and Sean Carter, you have to look at what Justin Bieber actually became in business terms. Not emotionally, not culturally, not symbolically, commercially. He became one of the most valuable pop assets of his generation. That means this story was never only about music. It was about master recordings, publishing, touring, merchandising, branding, licensing, catalog value, future releases, public image stability. Access to the man at the center of the machine. Access is money in Hollywood. Proximity is money. Association is money. A text back can be money. A reunion can be money. A public photo can be money. A symbolic reconciliation can be money. A cosign can be money. Even silence can protect money. That is the ecosystem. And once you understand that, the whole old friend versus old mentor frame starts looking way too innocent. Because what exactly does it mean when a star of Justin's scale starts withdrawing from earlier relationships? It means somebody loses something. Maybe not immediately, maybe not on paper, maybe not in a way the public can screenshot and post, but they lose something. Influence, visibility, cultural leverage, historical centrality, potential business upside, soft power, the ability to say, I'm still one of the people who matters to him. That last one is huge. In this business, symbolic relevance becomes material value way more often than people realize. The person who still has access to the star can still open doors, still shape narratives, still stay in the room, still pitch, still connect, still matter. The person who no longer has access starts drifting toward the museum section of the story. And Hollywood hates the museum section. It wants living relevance, not historical credit alone. This is why I keep circling back to one ugly possibility, not a proven fact, a possibility. That part of the tension around Justin's shrinking circle may not simply be emotional hurt. It may be that old relationships become much more unstable when the person at the center stops functioning as an open node in other people's systems. That doesn't mean everyone around him is a parasite, don't cheapen it. But it does mean this world is never as emotionally pure as the public would like to believe. Think about how many people build secondary value around Justin Bieber's existence. Managers build empires. Collaborators build moments. Brands build campaigns. Media outlets build traffic. Tour infrastructure build revenue. A whole galaxy of professionals build careers or chunks of careers around the gravitational field of one very young person becoming very, very famous. That's not unique to Justin, but the scale with Justin was monstrous. Which means the aftermath is monstrous too. Because when a star who has powered that many careers, narratives and institutions begins pulling back, the aftershocks do not remain private, they roll through the whole network. The public sees an unfollow, somebody else sees a closed door. The public sees a skipped reunion, somebody else sees a vanished opportunity. The public sees he's keeping his circle small, somebody else hears you are not in the circle anymore, and once that starts happening, people get mean in very polished ways. They start planting little interpretations, they start soft framing the star as unstable, ungrateful, difficult, confusing, rude, disconnected, emotional, unreliable. Not always with one big malicious campaign. Sometimes just with 1,000 little nudges. A phrase here, a source there, a vibe, a shrug, a quiet little "I don't know what's going on with him." That's how reputation gets softened up in Hollywood, death by 1,000 tasteful cuts. And if Justin has really been disengaging from old structures, old handlers, old emotional claims, or old centers of influence, then I guarantee you there are people who experience that not merely as personal loss, but as strategic threat. That is when ugly stories get born. Because here is the nasty little secret underneath almost every concerned celebrity whisper campaign. Concern and control are often wearing the same coat. People say they're worried, maybe they are. People say he is not acting like himself, maybe he isn't. People say he's shutting people out, maybe he is. But underneath all that concern can also be a very selfish panic. What if he no longer needs me? What if he no longer trusts me? What if he no longer wants me anywhere near the next version of his life? What if the story keeps moving and I am not in it? That panic can turn former allies into very elegant enemies. Now let's take a hard look at Justin's adulthood as a business problem for the people who once benefited from the boy version of Justin. The boy version was usable in a way adulthood is not. The boy version was responsive to shaping. The boy version fit neatly into the discovery myth. The boy version could be framed, sold, guided, corrected, disciplined, marketed, rescued, and explained by older people. The adult version has memory. The adult version can look back. The adult version can question how things were done. The adult version can choose silence in a way that scares people. The adult version can decide who gets cut off and never explain why. That is much harder to control. And that is why adulthood is such a dangerous phase for former child stars. Not because adulthood itself ruins them, but because adulthood is when they start becoming narrators of their own past. That's the threat. Not the age, the authorship. Because once Justin Bieber is not just the subject of the story, but the potential author of the story, everybody connected to the early chapters has to start worrying about how those chapters might someday be told. I'm not saying Justin has announced some grand expose. He hasn't. I'm not saying he has publicly accused the old orbit of specific wrongdoing in this context. He hasn't. What I'm saying is that mere uncertainty is enough to destabilize people. If the center of the machine is no longer obedient to the machine's preferred mythology, everybody who depended on that mythology gets jumpy. And jumpy people do reckless things, like approaching someone with visible anger in a room where that anger was never supposed to surface. That's why this story keeps feeling bigger to me than the public version admits, because if the issue were minor, the emotional discipline would have held. Now I want to take you into another room, not literally, but psychologically. The room where Justin has to decide what to do with gratitude. This is one of the most twisted emotional traps in celebrity life. Gratitude is supposed to be beautiful, human, grounding, moral, but in power relationships, gratitude can become incredibly coercive, especially when it gets confused with permanent access, permanent loyalty, or permanent silence. What does Justin owe the people who helped launch him? The answer sounds easy until you really sit with it. He owes acknowledgement of reality, sure. He owes basic human decency, sure. He owes fairness, maybe. He owes honesty, ideally. But does he owe open-ended emotional availability forever? Does he owe symbolic tribute on demand? Does he owe old players a permanent office inside his adult identity? Does he owe everyone from the origin story the right to keep interpreting his life? Absolutely not. And yet, that is often exactly what famous people get pressured into giving. Not because somebody writes it in a contract, but because the emotional culture around fame is built on unspoken expectations. Remember who helped you. Don't act brand new. Don't forget where you came from. Don't ice out the people who were there in the beginning. Again, those lines sound moral. Sometimes they are moral. Sometimes they're just cleaner sounding versions of stay accessible to people who feel invested in you. And if Justin has finally decided he cannot live under those expectations anymore, then every old relationship becomes a site of conflict. Not because he hates everyone, not because everyone around him is evil, but because boundaries feel brutal to people who were accustomed to emotional entitlement. That's the phrase, emotional entitlement. It can exist in families, in friendships, in marriages, in churches, in creative partnerships, and yes, in mentor relationships. A person starts believing they deserve a certain place in your life because of what they once were to you. Maybe they do deserve respect. Maybe they do deserve some version of acknowledgement. But once deserving respect mutates into expecting enduring access, the whole thing goes rotten. And they can't shake the suspicion that part of what exploded between Justin and Usher lives exactly there. Not necessarily in a dramatic scandal movie way, in a quieter, more poisonous way. A sense of place. A sense of what is owed. A sense of who still gets to speak with heat and expect to be heard. Because that is another thing people miss. Confrontation itself implies expectation. If you walk up to someone angrily in a room like that, some part of you believes you still have standing. You still think you are entitled to press the issue. You still think the relationship history or hierarchy gives you the right to demand engagement. That is not a neutral move. And if Justin has stopped recognizing that standing the same way, then even the act of confrontation becomes part of the injury. Now let's layer in marriage, adulthood, and fatherhood, because those stages don't just change a celebrity's schedule, they change his internal loyalties. Once a man becomes a husband, once he becomes a father, the old network often discovers very quickly that it no longer has first claim on his attention, time, vulnerability, or cares. And if Justin's emotional world has narrowed toward home, toward protection, toward whatever version of privacy he can still carve out, then the contrast between old Hollywood relationships and present-day priorities becomes even sharper. That shift can feel like abandonment to people who were once central. And abandonment, especially in male ego structures, often gets re-expressed as anger. Not sadness, not grief, not I miss the closeness we used to have. Anger. Because anger feels stronger, safer, less humiliating. So if Usher came into that room hot, I don't just hear disrespect, I hear maybe years of unresolved repositioning. A younger man moving on. An older legacy figure refusing even for a moment to accept the new coordinates quietly. And here's what makes it even uglier. Justin may not have the language, the energy, or even the desire to explain any of this cleanly. People always assume that if someone is serious about boundaries, he'll articulate them beautifully. That's fantasy. Real damaged people often set boundaries messily, late, inconsistently, contradictorily. One day with silence, one day with distance, one day with a hard cutoff, one day with warmth again, then distance again. That inconsistency drives everybody around them insane. But inconsistency doesn't always mean the boundary is fake. Sometimes it means the person setting it is still learning how not to drown. And Justin has looked for years like a man learning in public how not to drown. That doesn't excuse every decision he makes. Let's not do saint-making nonsense. He can be selfish, he can be immature, he can be cold, he can be difficult. Of course he can. Most people can. Fame just magnifies it. But I am deeply suspicious of narratives that flatten a former child star's adulthood into he changed, without asking what kind of pressure cooker produced the change. Of course he changed. He had to. The real question is whether the people around him were willing to let him. That question matters in every old relationship attached to his rise. And here is where the larger entertainment industry comes into focus. Because this story is not only about Justin and Usher. It's about Hollywood's entire addiction to the found boy, the saved girl, the discovered prodigy, the fragile genius who gets brought into the palace by powerful adults. And then spends years paying for that entry in ways nobody wants to count honestly. The industry loves origin myths, because origin myths conceal extraction. They turn complicated pipelines into destiny. They turn adults with strategic interest into benevolent visionaries. They turn unequal power structures into magical opportunities. They turn children into legends before those children even understand what the legend is going to cost. And later, when the legend starts malfunctioning, the industry acts confused. Why is he erratic? Why is he distant? Why is he difficult? Why won't he just embrace the people who helped him? Maybe because the cost of being helped was never emotionally simple. Maybe because history is not always warm from the inside. Maybe because the same relationships that built a career can become unbearable once the person at the center starts remembering what it felt like to be built. That's the sentence that keeps hitting me. Remembering what it felt like to be built. Not loved, not encouraged. Built, constructed, managed, arranged, narrated, positioned, scaled. If Justin is living in any relationship to that feeling now, even subconsciously, then it would explain a lot. The distance, the cuts, the unpredictability, the protective withdrawal, the resistance to old symbolic gestures. The sensitivity around people who still see themselves as architects of his life. And if someone with architect energy walks up to him angrily in a room full of Hollywood witnesses, yeah, I can absolutely see how that becomes explosive even if no one throws a punch. Because sometimes no physical fight is needed. Sometimes the emotional material is already volatile enough. Now I want to talk about image triage, because after incidents like this, the most revealing thing is often not the confrontation itself, but what doesn't happen afterwards. No sweeping public statement, no joint photo, no dramatic clarification, no polished Via Brothers cleanup tour, no substantial public unpacking. That silence tells me one of two things. Either the people involved believe saying less preserves more, or the actual fault line is too deep to patch with a quick public performance. I lean towards the second. Because easy celebrity misunderstandings usually get easy celebrity fixes. A quote to a friendly outlet, a laughing denial, a few vague words about love and respect. Done. But when the silence stays heavy, I start suspecting that nobody knows how to neutralize the full truth without making things worse. And that to me is the strongest clue of all. The confrontation is probably sitting on top of emotional material too sensitive, too layered, and too consequential to summarize publicly. That's why the coverage remains vague. That's why the language stays cautious. That's why the room still feels smoky, even though no one will tell us exactly what burned. And once I got to that point, the whole story snapped into focus for me. What really happened between Justin Bieber and Usher at Beyoncé's Oscars party? Probably not one single thing. Probably not one sentence, not one insult, not one petty misunderstanding. What really happened was history. Showed up drunk on old power, old hurt, old loyalty, old ego, old commercial ghosts, and old expectations. About who still gets to matter in whose life. What really happened was the original Bieber mythology collided with the adult man standing where the boy used to be. What really happened was a bond built in the star-making years. Ran straight into the reality that Justin Bieber may be trying to reclaim authorship over his life from the people and systems that once helped define it. And if that's true, then Usher was never just confronting Justin. He was confronting the loss of a certain version of Justin, maybe even the loss of his own place in that version. And Justin was never just reacting to Usher. He was reacting to the whole weight of what old relationships come to represent. When your past was monetized, before you were mature enough to understand the deal. That is why the party mattered. Not because it was loud, not because it was glamorous, not because the blogs got fat. Because for one brief moment, one of modern pop's most polished mental myths cracked in public, and through that crack you could see the real machinery underneath. The debt, the ownership panic, the boundary war, the struggle over who gets to narrate the past, the deep discomfort that shows up when the child at the center of a profitable legend grows into an adult who no longer seems willing to keep the legend convenient. That's the story, not the clickbait version, not the sanitized PR version, the real ugly human one. And the filthiest part of all? Hollywood will probably keep trying to sell this as a mystery between two stars. Just another what really happened headline. Just another little scandal cloud over the after party. But I don't think it's a mystery. I think it's fallout. Fallout from years of fame without normal development. Fallout from mentorship without clean boundaries. Fallout from gratitude getting tangled up with excess. Fallout from money, mythology and masculinity fermenting together until one night the room can't hold it anymore. That's what I think really happened. Not a random fight, a rupture. A rupture between the machine that made Justin Bieber and the man Justin Bieber may be trying to become. And once you see it that way, the silence after the party starts sounding even louder than the confrontation itself. Because silence is where Hollywood buries the stories that cut too close to the bone. That's it for tonight. If you made it this far, you already know this industry runs on secrets, ego, money and beautifully packaged lies. And I'm gonna keep dragging every last one of them into the light. So subscribe, smash the like button. Drop in the comments who you want me to investigate next. And if you've got insider info, if you were in the room, if you know what they're trying to bury, send it. Anonymity is 100% guaranteed. My contacts are in the description. Until next time, keep your eyes open, keep your mouth shut around industry snakes. And remember this. In Hollywood, the truth never disappears, it just puts on better clothes. I am Strange, and this was Dirty Hollywood. In Hollywood, the truth never disappears, it just puts on better clothes. I'm Strange, and this was Dirty Hollywood.